I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Join me on a quest to find awe and wonder in all creation, human or wild, vast or small, spiritual encounters that move us beyond words.
We weren't left here, by some cosmic mistake 1,000,000 years ago. We are part of this place. Far too many people have this feeling of not belonging here. They don't feel connected to or touched by the outdoors and the world that we grew from. If something touches your essence as a human being in our daily lives, if we feel disconnected from that, I feel that we're far away from part of our spiritual nature.
Nature lover and spiritual nature lover, Douglas Wood is a youthful 72. He has guided scores of canoe tours into Minnesota's celebrated boundary waters and associated wilderness areas. Work as a nature guide is a central passion of his. Doug is a singer and songwriter, a husband and father and grandfather, and author of numerous books for young and old alike, with over 2.5 million copies in print, among them the children's books Old Turtle and also Old Turtle and the Broken Truth. If anyone can inspire a deep connection to nature and its meanings for us humans, it's this guy. In this episode, you'll get a sense for just how sincerely Doug adores all nature and sings its praises, but most specifically, he is in the thrall of North America's lake country, where he lives. It's a region called the Boundary Waters, dotted with untold lakes and streams. And yet, for half of his life, Doug Wood felt terribly disconnected, lost, adrift, and unsure about self-worth and his place in the world. He was well into adulthood when clarity first came to him about these confused feelings. Before he discovered that he belonged somewhere, he first needed to learn that he had been living with both dyslexia and attention deficit disorder. That critical information unriddled for him how and why he once viewed himself as a failure and misfit.
I just had this feeling, the bad feeling about myself. When you're little, you're 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, that's all you know, is that you're failing and everybody else can do stuff that you can't do, and you're getting in trouble all the time. But still, through many decades in adulthood, that feeling would often come back whenever I would fail or feel ashamed about something. And still, sometimes it still does.
It's an all-too-common human predicament, his experience of feeling disconnected, as he says, not belonging, adrift, rudderless, whatever the cause. Doug will tell us about how he grappled with his situation and what it was that changed for him. Among life's most universal questions are where can we belong, and how will we ever feel that we belong? For Doug, these questions were intensely and existentially challenging. He was 40 years old when the pivot came for him, an epiphany that set him on a new course and reshaped his life. We'll jump right to that part of his story, and a serendipity few of us welcome, the serendipity of getting very sick. In this instance, it was fortuitous because it led him to ask his wife to read aloud to him from a famous nature writer whom he had only recently heard of.
I was a music teacher at the time. And a couple of weeks before, one of my high school students walked in my office and saw all these pictures all over the walls of northern Minnesota, Canada, the North Country Wilderness, the North Woods, as we call it. She said, "You look like a person who would enjoy reading Sig Olson." And I said, "Who's Sig Olson?" I never heard of him. So she told me, and I went and got some of his books at the school library, took them home and didn't read them. And some weeks later, I got this horrible case of the flu. My wife, Kathy, asked if there was anything she could do to make me feel better, because I couldn't watch TV, I couldn't read, I had too bad of a headache, I was miserable. And I said, "Would you just maybe read me one of those books by that Olson guy that I brought home from school?" So she started reading from the first chapter of Listening Point, his second book, I believe.
In that first chapter of Sigurd Olson's Listening Point, the renowned 20th century wilderness guide and nature writer describes his long-held dream of finding a spot of wild earth and trees and water, a single spot he could return to in all seasons as the years cycled by, a place to feel grounded. One day he found just such a spot and recognized it instantly. Here are some of Sig Olson's words from that chapter Doug Wood found so powerful.
As I sat there on the rock, I realized that in spite of the closeness of civilization, this remnant of the old wilderness would speak to me of silence and solitude, of belonging and wonder and beauty. Though the point was only a small part of the vastness reaching far to the Arctic, from it I could survey the whole. Wilderness sounds would be here, bird songs in the mornings and at dusk. The aspen leaves would whisper and the pines as well. And in the sound of water and wind, I would hear all that is worth listening for. I would come in all seasons, when the first buds of spring were painting the hillsides, when the sounds of summer made it seem as though the woods were pulsating with life. I would be here in the autumns, watching the pageantry of color, in the winter when the lake was frozen and still and the land deep with snow. I would come to listen and feel and to recapture for a little while the old joys I had known. I named this place Listening Point, because only when one comes to listen, only when one is aware and still, can things be seen and heard. Everyone has a listening point somewhere. It does not have to be in the north or close to the wilderness, but some place of quiet where the universe can be contemplated with awe.
Tears started flowing down my cheeks, and it wasn't because I felt so miserable. It was because after all my youth of loving the Northwoods and loving the outdoors, but being very unfocused and not really having any idea what to do with these feelings, then through Kathy's voice and through Sig's words, it was like a window being thrown open on a new way of seeing the world. And I get very emotional when I talk about it. And that changed my life. In that very moment, it was like a doorway opened and I could see a path. I couldn't see very far, couldn't imagine where the path was going to lead. But I did see that there's another person that feels like I do. And maybe there's something I could do in my life, something like that, and stay connected to the Northwoods in a creative, meaningful way.
Now, here it bears mentioning that by this time, Sigurd Olson's name as a preeminent environmentalist was known far and wide, well beyond his home near the boundary waters of Minnesota. Beginning back in the 1920s, Sig had fought to protect the lakeland wilderness of the Quetico Superior region from expanding commerce and industry. He led efforts to keep roads, dams, and airplanes out of the area. Eventually, he served as president of the National Parks Association, that was in the 50s, an advisor to the U.S. Secretary of the Interior until the early 1970s. Sig was one of the leading voices behind the Wilderness Act of 1964, and his fingerprint on the history of wilderness preservation in North America remains still today, from the Everglades to Alaska. But back to Doug and the profound impact of hearing Sig's words for the first time. Catching that awful flu would lead to a friendship.
I met Sigurd Olson after I devoured his books, and I sent him a letter. And he wrote a letter back, which I had within 4 days, 2-page typewritten letter that said that was the most beautiful appreciation of his writing he had ever received, which felt wonderful to me, felt like a wonderful affirmation. I was teaching school at the time in a little town called Morris, Minnesota, out on the prairie. And he encouraged me to pursue my dreams. He said that I had talent. He could tell that from the letter. And I told him I also wrote music and performed. He just sent me a very encouraging letter. And that was really the start of my adult lifetime, of the journey I've been on ever since.
I'm going to go back to you're being sick in bed. Kathy is reading to you. The tears come. Tell me just exactly what those tears kind of meant.
A kindred spirit, somebody who knew a lot more than I did, but had obviously the same feelings that I had, which I hadn't run into. I read Outdoor Life magazine and Field and Stream, and I fished and I hunted. My granddad taught me how to fish, and my dad taught me how to hunt, and we camped, and we did all these things. But there's a difference between enjoying being out of doors and having fun and loving to paddle a canoe or to be in a fishing boat. That's all great. But there's a deeper level of connection. If we perceive nature as just something that's pretty, oh, that's a pretty sunset, or that's an ugly piece of land, or I really like mountains, I think mountains are great, or I really like the ocean. Okay, well, that's fine, but it's kind of all superficial. And Sig wrote from a depth of understanding and a depth of need, his need of wild things and wild places, that he, in his letter to me, said that I shared. He said, he so beautifully expressed, so hauntingly expressed your need for the North Country and for wild things. So he acknowledged the connection, what he saw in me, and I certainly felt it from him. And then I read all of his books. I became a wilderness canoe guide as he was. I led people scores and scores of trips through the North Country all the way to the Northwest Territories. And eventually I became the president of the Listening Point Foundation and helped to manage Sig Olson's legacy.
Douglas Wood's recent book, A Wild Path, is a collection of insightful essays about what he learned from Sig Olson about wilderness back then, and what he's learned from wilderness directly in subsequent episodes of his life. I invited Doug to share more detail with us about the North Woods that are so precious to people like him and Sig and countless others, including detail about the place Sigurd Olson dubbed his listening point. When we say North Woods, we're talking about a vast place in the far northeastern corner of Minnesota, up against Lake Superior, and extending from there northward into Canada. As you listen, you'll want to imagine yourself at listening point. The lapping water, the call of loons in the evening, a rough log cabin standing there beside Burntside Lake. The whole of it surrounded by trees, cedar, birch, aspen, maple, white pine, and red.
The Canadian Shield covers 3.5 million square miles, all the way from the East Coast, from Newfoundland and Maine, all the way to northwest of Hudson Bay. And it also dips down into northern Minnesota. And what the Canadian Shield is a huge area of glaciated igneous rock. And when the glaciers were a mile thick and a mile high, they scraped off all of the soil, every bit of anything that was on that rock, and left just the rock. And the glaciers left about 10,000 years ago, which sounds like a long time, but geologically speaking, it's the snap of a finger. So when you go to northern Minnesota and on up into Ontario and Saskatchewan and Canada, you are on this land that is mostly rock. And then dotting the rock, sometimes there's more water than there is land. There's hundreds of thousands of lakes. There are towns here and there. There's a highway or two across it. But it's basically wilderness. Listening Point is at the very southern edge of that Canadian Shield. And so that was Sigurd Olson's place where he went, and he called it Listening Point because that's where he went to listen to the land, to listen to the universe, to listen to his own imagination, and to remember all the places he had been in his wilderness canoe trips of a lifetime.
Sigurd Olson's former home, where he actually did most of his writing, stands in Ely, Minnesota. It's just a short drive from Listening Point. The small cabin at Listening Point was a destination reserved for, well, just listening.
I got to go visit Sig at his house in Ely, Minnesota, which is the town that's known as the doorstep of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. And I got to go there and sit in his living room and smell the pipe smoke and listen to him tell stories. And then on the property was also a little tiny, what he called his writing shack. As a writer, he didn't really write at Listening Point, which I assumed he did, but he did not, because he said there were too many interesting things to see and hear there. The wind through the white pines and the red pines, the sound of waves lapping on the shore, the sound of loons calling, sometimes wolves howling in the distance, wildflowers blooming, everything that one would love about a wild place, plus his old 150-year-old cabin. So when he was there, he just soaked it up and enjoyed it and got images and feelings and thoughts that he took back with him to town. And he sat in this little converted 1915 Model T garage, which he called his writing shack, with photographs and maps and stuff all over the walls and books everywhere and rocks everywhere. And that's where he wrote the books, and that's where I sat. and listen to him on the chance I had to go there and visit with him.
So I understand from his career, he was so instrumental in establishing these reserves, these wilderness areas, the boundary waters themselves. So much credit goes to his efforts there. When you met him, was that already mostly all accomplished and he had kind of secured his legacy? He was kind of a legend.
That is true. And yes, that had already happened when I met him. But not very long before I met him came kind of the climax, the final battle, if you will, to preserve what we call the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. And the battle had been going on since the 1920s, one threat after another. They were going to build a road to every lake. That was the mantra of the chambers of commerce. They were going to dam up all the waterways and make huge, wonderful recreational lakes and dam up the rivers and the streams. They were going to log it all. They were going to have mining in all of it. And airplanes. After World War II, all these pilots came back from Europe. They were going to have planes flying into every lake in the Boundary Waters. Well, the Boundary Waters is the most loved and the most used wilderness in the whole eastern half of the United States. So there were many people who were anxious to save it and preserve it and keep it a place of quiet and silence and wildness. But Sig led those efforts. For 50 years, he led those efforts. So in many ways, I consider him the grandfather, the father of the Boundary Waters wilderness. But along the way, he helped save wilderness areas all over the continent, from Alaska to Point Reyes to the East Coast and the southern wilderness of the Everglades. He was involved in all of that. And he was my hero. I lost my grandfather when I was just barely turned 13 years old. He's the one who made me feel wonderful about being myself when other things weren't so wonderful. And I lost him at a very young age and was kind of lost myself for a number of years. And then I discovered the books of Sig Olson, exchanged many letters with him, a couple dozen, 3 dozen letters, and the chance to go and meet him a couple of times in Ely. So later, when I wrote my first book, Old Turtle, which became very well known, Sigurd had passed away by then. But I took it up to Ely and showed it to his widow, Elizabeth. She was one of the first 3 or 4 people I showed that to. And she read it page by page, and then she stacked up the papers, up and down on a table to sort them out and make them nice and level. She handed it back to me, and she looked up and she said, "Don't you let them change a word of it." So she was kind of like another grandmother also.
So it's one thing to love the wild, to love seeing the moose, to hear the loon on the lake. Sig added something beyond just that enjoyment, I think. I'm wondering if you would agree on what that is that he added. What did they do to you, these writings?
Well, sure, that's exactly it. I mean, I had been enjoying all those things all my life. I didn't know as much about them, nearly as much about them as Sigurd did. And that was part of my journey, to begin to learn the names of every plant, every wildflower, every tree, every rock, and their stories, and where did they come from, and why were things the way they were, and how did the glaciers work, and how does fire ecology, all that was going to be part of my journey. But what attracted me to it was that wasn't really the point with Sig, not knowing all the facts, not knowing every name, but trying, as he put it in one of his books, he wrote, trying to catch the meanings that were there in that moment before the lifting of the dark, as he was sitting on a lakeshore at sunrise. And that was it. He was always trying to catch the meanings. What does it mean that there is wilderness? What does it mean to be able to experience the world as our great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers and grandmothers experienced the world? What we call wilderness, for most of human history, was just the world, the way the world was. And that's how we evolved. And so those meanings, as I said, they run very deep within us. They don't disappear after 100 years of the machine age or the Industrial Revolution or 150 years. They're as present as our next breath. And so that was his lifelong mission, was to try and reconnect people with wild nature and what we call wilderness.
You're listening to Constant Wonder. I'm Marcus Smith. My guest is Douglas Wood. He has written over 40 beloved children's books, and his most recent book, this one for adults, is A Wild Path. As important as everything is that Doug has shared with us so far, I'm especially fond of what we get to share with you a few minutes from now here on Constant Wonder, as Doug tells a story about a campfire, a harmonica, and a moment of sheer transcendence. A moment that came about during a memorial held by people Doug scarcely knew in honor of someone he never knew. My backcountry experience is with backpacks, climbing mountain peaks here in the Rocky Mountains, canyon country, all the way from Grand Canyon up to the Wind Rivers. There is a certain kind of experience that for me is, so often we just toss off the word spiritual, but there's some aspects of beauty, an otherworldly kind of zone you can get in.
I don't object at all to your use of the word spiritual. It's a kind of a loaded word, and it can be tossed off rather easily. You need to define it. And for me, spiritual just means the essence of something. So if something touches your essence as a human being, what does it mean to be a human being? Well, could be a lifelong discussion. But if it touches you more deeply than just, I like Coca-Cola, I like how it tastes, fine, great. That's the level at which we function much of our lives. But there are certain times in our lives when we function more deeply than that. And when things touch us deeply, it might be a Beethoven symphony, or Rachmaninoff's piano concerto, or it might be a beautiful painting or photograph. But even more than those things, in my opinion, is the place that we live, the planet on which we live. Far too many people have this feeling of not belonging here. They just don't feel touched. They don't feel connected to or touched by the outdoors and the world that we grew from. As much as a redwood tree or a flower, we are an outgrowth of planet Earth. And we weren't left here by some cosmic mistake a million years ago. We are part of this place. And so in our daily lives, if we feel disconnected from that, I feel that we're far away from part of our spiritual nature. And I think that Sig, and perhaps me, if I'm a little bit lucky in some of my writings, we try and touch that spiritual essential nature of being connected to the natural world in our lives.
I like what you said about essence and connection. A lot of times we try to imagine who we are and what our existence is, but we're not doing it in the context of everything around us. I'm just imagining you in a place, or Sig in a place, on the edge of a lake. You've done the hard work of the day. There's some quiet time. The breeze or the wind is just light. You've had your meal. And as the sun maybe is going down, or I'm imagining that loon call, which I've heard out here west too. So it's not just the essence of Doug. It's also the essence of the loon. It's the essence of the lake. It's the essential nature of the full context.
Yeah. First of all, it doesn't have to be in the wilderness. Sig wrote about, in his book, Listening Point, he said, everyone can have a listening point somewhere. It doesn't have to be far from home. It doesn't have to be deep in the wilderness. A place where you go to simply feel connected and to behold the universe with awe. That was his phrase. And if you find that place, you found a listening point. Maybe it won't be your listening point all your life. Maybe it will be. Maybe it just is for that moment. But you can create for yourself opportunities for that kind of thing to happen. There's a little stream 4 miles from my cabin here in the woods. I love sitting here in my woods. The snow is just beginning to come down right now, very gently. I've got these big 150-year-old white pines all around the cabin here. This is a great place. But sometimes I will leave the cabin and jump in the car, get on the motorcycle, and ride 5 miles to this little stream. And I love to sit by the stream and just listen to it, and just listen to the sound of it until that sound fills all my senses, the sound and the smell and the sight of the sun glinting off the water. And the sound itself can almost be like a mantra if you're interested in what many people call meditation. I often don't even call it meditation. I just call it being still, because meditation sounds like too much like medication. So I just like to go somewhere where I can just be still. Now, be still means keeping your feet still, and it means keeping your hands still. But it also means getting still inside. See, that's a more difficult challenge. And if you are able to do that, then you've opened up the opportunity in that stillness to feel connected. And so I like to go to my little stream and listen to the water flowing in it and imagine, perhaps remember many of the other rivers and streams I've sat beside or paddled or run rapids. We have an island in the North Country in Voyageurs National Park. I love to sit on the shore on a windy day and just listen to the waves crashing. So sound can be a part of it, or even the lack of sound. If you're in a wilderness area where there are no man-made sounds, and you experience true silence, that can be profound. I remember many years ago, I had a group of 8 people, and we were in the Boundary Waters, a favorite loop of mine, and I decided I wanted everybody to just get to experience what it was like to be alone in the wilderness for just a few hours. So we took all the canoes out, and I dropped people off here and there, each one on their own island or their own little rocky point. I said, just relax and enjoy it and see what comes, and I'll be back in 4 hours and pick you up. And it was very meaningful for a lot of the folks, but I'll never forget Donna. Came back 4 hours later to get Donna, and she was actually flushed. Her face was red. She was in this state of extra openness, noticing everything, feeling everything. I don't know the right word to call it right now. And in that moment, she said, "Doug, I've never had this feeling before." And I said, "What feeling is that, Donna?" And she said, "Well, I don't think I've ever in my whole life actually been completely alone before." Yes, you can be sitting in your house alone, but you know that the phone is there, the TV is there, the radio's there, you go out your door, there's the street, all the other houses. All. For Donna, that moment was she felt really alone, surrounded by the wild world. And it was such an exciting, wonderful, meaningful experience for her. I'll never have that experience again because I've had it too many times. But for her, that was the very first time, and it was full of meaning.
You know, there was one time when I was hiking at Zion National Park, and I heard somebody they had their headset on, and they wanted just the total epic life experience where they were listening to a Mahler symphony on their headset while climbing to Angel's Landing, you know? And I just thought that was a little overkill. Too epic all at once.
Yeah.
But it did make me wonder, because you come from musical parents, you studied music in college, and became a music teacher, a singer, and a songwriter yourself. I had to wonder, what is the place of music, which is clearly a source of awe? What's the place of music in relation to the kind of essential wilderness and listening in silence experiences that you write about? Can they be complementary? Can you square that circle for us?
Yeah. Let me tell you this little story, which is in the book, so you probably read it. But anyway, yes, I grew up in a musical family. My mother and dad were both music professors, college music professors. My dad was a PhD in sacred music. Music's always been almost like breathing to me. So I'm always surrounded by music, and I've done a lot with music. So I love Mahler. I love Rachmaninoff. I love Mozart. I also love Duke Ellington, and I love Louis Armstrong, and I love Willie Nelson. It's a wide palette, a broad palette. But the most beautiful piece of music I ever heard in my whole life, I was in an outdoor conference, maybe 800, 1,000 people there in Missouri, backcountry Missouri. And I was there to sing my Earth songs. I hadn't written any books yet, but I was singing my music, doing my music. And it said there was going to be a black powder reenactors session under the moonlight, under the starlight, out on the prairie, out on the meadow. And they're going to have a campfire in this black powder thing with the guys with their fringes and their buckskins and their long rifles. So I thought, well, that sounds fun. I'll go to that. And I got there, and there were these, the closest around the campfire was this ring, this circle of ground chairs, just little low chairs, barely off the ground, just to sit so your butt doesn't get wet on the ground, you know. And each chair was covered with buckskins, and that's where these mountain men were going to sit. And then the other visitors would sit around them, around the campfire. So they got the fire going. It was a beautiful evening, and all the guys sat down, gals sat down in their chairs, and there was one chair that was empty. And it got quiet, got time to start the program. And so this guy sitting next to the empty chair stood up, and he said, I get emotional here. He said, you all know why this chair is empty. Bill planned to be here. Bill planned this conference. He poured his heart into it for a year and a half. But he knew he might not make it, and he didn't. He didn't explain what happened to Bill, but one assumes he had a terminal illness. He said, Bill couldn't be here tonight, but he had a favorite song, so I'm going to play it for him now. And he reaches into his buckskin pouch, and he pulls out a harmonica, and no accompaniment, nobody playing a guitar, nothing. And he just starts playing, and he could play really well. And he played the first 4 notes. I knew what it was. It was the wonderful American folk song Shenandoah. And the notes just rang out under the stars with that beautiful vibrato that you can do with a harmonica. Sounds very much like a human voice. And I cried, and I still cry when I think about it. That's the most beautiful piece of music I've ever heard, because it wasn't just the notes of Shenandoah, which I've heard a million times. It wasn't just the sound of the harmonica. It was the stars, and the campfire, and the buckskins, and the meadow, and the shadows of the dark trees all around. It was all of it connected together. And to me, that's the connection between art and nature, and music and nature. Sorry I get so emotional. It's hard for me to... When I remember it, I have the same reaction every time. When I was writing the story in the book, I had tears coming down my cheeks. I could barely type. And it wasn't that, we all die. It's not that. It was just the power of the moment and that wonderful artistic, creative thing going on with the natural surroundings and the emotion that all the people felt, all of it fitting together in some kind of marvelous way.
Sometimes you just sit and absorb a moment like that, even shared moments, like that campfire with the harmonica. Nothing is said, nothing needs to be said, and other times you feel like you have to run and find somebody to share it with, and you need to either whisper or shout about it to others, and the moment just isn't complete until you do. And you have a great story about the need to share a moment involving the first time your son, maybe it was your grandson, I can't quite remember, the two of you seeing the Northern Lights.
That was actually with my son when he was little. I had seen the Northern Lights any number of times, but Brian had not. And we were paddling on the Mississippi River near our home here. First outing of the spring. Got the canoe down out of the rafters, out of the garage, threw it on my shoulders, hiked down to the Mississippi, and out we went. And I just whispered, I said, look, Brian, look, the Northern Lights. Whispering like if I spoke out loud, they would disappear, And we kept watching, and usually the Northern Lights are in the north. And most often they're a light green color. But in this case, the lights began to spread all around the whole 360 degrees of the horizon and then arch up over our heads till they created, what Brian said, look, Dad, it's a teepee, and we're right in the middle. And in the middle of the teepee was this hole, like a smoke hole in a real teepee, opening up to the universe. And Brian said, Dad, we got to go show Mom and Eric. We got to show them this. So we paddled back to shore as fast as we could, thinking that they might disappear at any moment, but they didn't. So we got home, and Brian ran into the house yelling at the top of his lungs, "Look, come on, guys, you've got to see this." And they came out, and we just lay on our backs in the front yard for who knows how long, just absorbing it, watching the northern lights.
I understand that later, much later, you once went on a moose quest with Brian.
I took a group up to the far north to the Cree River, which flows north out of Cree Lake all the way up to Lake Athabasca. And this was going to be the first big trip that I took Brian on. I think he was 19 or so. And he had been to the Boundary Waters and Quetico with me, but somehow he had never seen a moose. And, Dad, do you think we'll see a moose? Are we going to see a moose on this trip? And I said, "Oh, I'm pretty sure we will, Brian, but you can never guarantee it. I'm not really sure." Well, we had a magnificent trip, but didn't see a moose. Brian still hadn't seen a moose, and I was feeling pretty bad about it. So around every bend in the river, we would crane our necks around and look. No moose. Finally, we'd just about given up, and we were nearing the end of the trip when we came around a big, wide turn in the river. No cover, just sandy shoreline, and there up ahead in the alders is a humongous moose. It looked as big as a garden shed with this enormous wide antlers, and just standing there, totally unconcerned. So I said to Brian in the bow, I said, "Just put your paddle down, Brian, hold really still." And I just slipped my paddle back and forth in the stern, steering without taking the paddle out of the water. And we drifted and drifted closer and closer till we were maybe 100 feet from that moose. And Brian was just transfixed. And the moose very, very slowly just turned around, pointed his antlers back through the alders, and we saw his big butt as he disappeared into the willows and the alders, and off he went. And we didn't even get a picture because we didn't want to move and grab a camera. But that picture will always be in my mind's eye. In fact, I found an oil painting of two people coming down a river in a canoe with a moose on the shoreline that looked like it could have been us. So that painting hangs in our living room now.
You're listening to Constant Wonder. I'm Marcus Smith. My guest is Douglas Wood. His most recent book is titled A Wild Path. To understand Doug's success in finding his way to an essential self-understanding and a sense of his place in the world, we're going to hear more from him in just a bit about those childhood struggles, the wild path, as he might say, that eventually leads, we hope it leads, to some kind of safe harbor, some sense of place, a bright clearing in the woods. So, Doug, were you ever called Dougie when you were little?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. My wife still does.
Dougie, he's a young kid, world's big place. He's got a granddad. He's got somebody named Miss Little, I guess. Connect for me the challenges of learning disabilities or ADHD or dyslexia. Connect that with the people who were around you back then, and also it works its way into some sensibility, some connection to the natural world, even at that early age.
Yeah. I did an interview last week or a couple of weeks ago, and somebody asked me, well, what's the hardest thing about having ADHD? Thinking that, okay, it makes it hard to read, which it did. It makes it hard to sit in a chair and be still in school, yes. I also had dyslexia. It makes it hard to... I still am terrible at reading directions. I can read a novel, I can read a 900-page biography, but reading directions and putting something together, it's very hard for me. So she said, well, what's the hardest thing about having ADHD and dyslexia? And I said, well, by far, the hardest thing is how you feel. You just feel like a failure all the time. All the other kids in the class can read this and I can't read it. And the teacher is showing how to do a math problem on the board, and she gets halfway across the board with all the, the long division and the fractions and everything. And are there any questions? Well, I'm still back at the very top on the high left corner trying to understand where we started. And so when you're little, you're 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, that's all you know, is that you're failing and everybody else can do stuff that you can't do. And you're getting in trouble all the time, which I did also, just because I couldn't sit still and I couldn't mind and follow directions and do what I was supposed to do. So, and I had an episode when I was very young of sexual abuse that I never told anybody about for decades. So in these ways, I just had this feeling, just a bad feeling about myself. No, I didn't become a juvenile delinquent. No, I never went to prison. But I just had this very bad feeling. And I didn't have it when I was outdoors in the local woods, sitting by a stream, listening to the water, fishing for bluegills with a cane pole. I was a good fisherman. My granddad taught me how to fish, and I succeeded. I would usually win the family fishing derby even when I was a little kid, because I fished so hard and I would never stop. I'd get up in the morning and go fishing before breakfast and fish all day long, so I would catch more fish than anybody else. And while I'm having this success and learning how to cast, how to bait cast and hit a tiny little spot just 6 inches wide, way out 30 yards from the boat, I could do that. But while I'm having these successes, I'm also surrounded by beauty, by cattails and loons and tall trees and rocky shores. That was heaven. That was heaven to me. I couldn't feel bad. I didn't feel bad about myself then. It wasn't until many, many years later in my adulthood, I had some counseling. I studied psychology, nearly got a master's in psychology. I just didn't go and do the internship. And I decided I would apply what I learned to my writing and my guiding. But still, through many decades in adulthood, that feeling would often come back whenever I would fail or feel ashamed about something. And still, sometimes it still does. I'm not able to take medications that other people can take if it just doesn't agree with me. I've found my own ways of coping. And for me, this deep spiritual connection to the natural world, to the birds and creatures that are outside my window right now that I'm looking at, they were always there for me when perhaps human beings were not so much, because they didn't understand. Nobody heard of ADHD when I was a kid. Even my parents, I felt like I was always disappointing my parents. I never felt like I disappointed my granddad. He was that one special relationship. And then Miss Little. Miss Little was my early elementary school teacher, 2nd grade. She was hard on me. She didn't know anything about ADHD either, but she thought Douglas was smart for some reason. And she asked my parents, this was a different era, and we didn't have any tutors or paras or anybody around, at least that I never heard of. But Miss Little asked my parents, can I keep Douglas after school, like every day? and because I think he needs to learn how to read. And my parents said yes, which I thought was terrible. It was a terrible idea. I hated being in school, let alone being in school extra time after school. But Miss Little gave me that extra time. And just with patience and understanding and relentless helping, she taught me how to read. Now, to this very day, I'm a slow reader. It's not that I can't read the words. I just read slowly at the same speed that I talk. And my grandson, Henry, can read. He can read a 700-page Harry Potter novel 10 times faster than I could read it, which is great. I'm happy for Henry. But I don't have that ability to do that. But what I do have is the things we've talked about and the fact that Miss Little taught me not only how to read, but how to love books and love reading. And so that's been the story of my life. I became an author, wrote 40 books. Who knew?
There's a component of your story that's not about isolation. There's a component about drawing other people in and even going to the schools and being with children. The invitation to the wild, that's really important to me. And I didn't get invited until I was well into my 20s or early 30s. And I sometimes think, why did I not get invited? Who could have spoken out? This is like going out and taking somebody by the hand, or maybe it's, Brian running into the house and getting the whole family to come out and see the Northern Lights. This is such a beautiful thing when people extend that invitation to come and see. It's kind of like the Robert Frost poem, You Come Too.
You come too. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, what a wonderful little introduction you just gave to that whole idea. That's great, Marcus. In fact, I wrote it down. Invitation to the Wild. I might steal that. It might become a title of an essay or a book someday. And I'm glad that you picked up, and no one said it exactly like that to me before, but yeah, it is really important, this sharing aspect. And there's a phrase that I thought I had read in a book somewhere, and I've looked and Googled it. Nowadays we can Google stuff. And I haven't found it anywhere. So it may be that I said it and just forgot that I did. But the phrase is, beauty unshared is a dagger through the heart. Beauty unshared is a dagger through the heart. When you're out there and you see something great and you turn around and you point and you say, did you see? And there's nobody there to see it with you, to share it with you. I think that's very real. And on our canoe trips, usually we have 8 or 10 people, something like that. We're alone in thousands of square miles of wilderness. There's no towns, there's nobody around, and yet we're not alone. We've recreated one of the oldest groupings of human beings that goes back into our dim and distant past, the clan, the small group, and we share everything. There aren't any entertainments. We don't have transistor radios or computers or iPads along with us. It's just us, this little group of 8 people. And in that context, when there's nobody else, you don't hear any other voices from out in the woods, you don't see anybody. Well, then, after a few days, you get this feeling that there are exactly 8 people in the world. I know everybody in the world, and I know how they're feeling. I know what they're saying. I'm empathizing with it. Somebody got a fishhook stuck in their finger, and it really hurts, and it hurts me too because it hurts them. It's not on Facebook. It's not from 10,000 miles away. It's right here. And I call that the shrinking of the world. So at the same moment that you're out in this enormous wilderness and you're looking up at night into an inexplicable universe, a vast universe, and everything is expanding, at the same moment that everything is expanding, it's shrinking. And I know everybody in the world and they know me. What a powerful feeling that is. I think it's one of the things I enjoy most about wilderness experience. And the fact that when we sit around a campfire in the evening, it's a circle. There's no one part of the campfire circle that's higher than another part or more important than another part. It's just a circle of human beings. And nobody's more important or more successful. I've got all kinds of people on my trips, all kinds of people. And there's only one measure of success, and that is, are you helping the group to succeed? If you're doing that, then you're a success. And I love that feeling, that egalitarian aspect of wilderness travel.
It's so interesting that it's become a parody for people to say kumbaya, and people slight that. And in my experience, that vastness of the night sky around a fire with a small group of people does exactly what you just described.
Sometimes we go into the woods and there's a fire ban because there's a drought and you can't have a campfire. And we survive. We use a little propane cooking stove and it's fine. But there's something missing. There's something missing when you're not having that evening gathering, staring into these flames like human beings have done for, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of years. That is a part of almost our genetic components. It's part of who we are, part of who we've been on our experience on this planet. And so, yeah, I think that even a candle, even in an apartment, lighting a candle can give you that feeling of focus and beauty and warmth, or a fire in a fireplace, almost any form. I wanted to hop back, though, for a second, Marcus, because you asked about introductions. And I was going to tell you this other experience. I was at another wilderness conference. We were in the Rocky Mountains. I don't remember where. And there's one other guy and I were getting a little bored with all the talks and the workshops and stuff. So we decided to go off hiking. And we hiked up this long trail. We don't know where we were. We were not from the area. We just went exploring. And the trail came to a cliff, the cliff that went down from our feet, not up away from us. And there were hawks circling, riding the updrafts around this cliff, and it just fell away to like nowhere, long ways down. So we sat there. We put our butts on the ground, and we sat with our feet dangling over the cliff, just experiencing that. And I don't remember the guy's name. I don't know who he was. He said, "Doug, how do we introduce our kids to this?" And I said, "Yes, that's it exactly." And he said, "What?" And I said, "Introduce them." I don't know, it just, all of a sudden it came to me that if you've ever been, like I was, a shy kid, and you go to a party and you don't know anybody, you feel more alone there than you do alone out in the wilderness. It's a very lonesome feeling. And if there's a host who's got even a speck of empathy, that host is going to take you by the elbow or by the hand and say, "Doug, come over here. I want you to meet Marcus. Marcus is interested in the outdoors too." She might not know anything more about Marcus than that, but just enough to make an introduction. And making that introduction of a child or an adult to the wild, that might be all it takes. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to teach them every tree and every plant. Just an introduction, enough to say, this is worthwhile. This is interesting. This is, you might really like Marcus. He's a fascinating guy. And you might really love the Boundary Waters Canoe area. It's a fascinating place. So I think that's how that works.
Doug, I've yet to meet somebody who says, "Awe and wonder, that's not for me. I'd rather have a thorn in my foot." People don't say that. And awe and wonder are not just like a dessert. We're talking about experiences that are transformative.
Well, we began this program talking about Sig Olson, my mentor and my hero. That's what his books are full of. What you and I would call epiphanies. Can't remember for sure if he ever used that word, but he would write of these flashes of insight. That's what he called them. Flashes of insight. And that's why people like me who read Sig Olson's books love them so much, because he's able to transfer or communicate these flashes of insight that he would have, as I said earlier, trying to catch the meanings that were there in some wild place and communicate them to the reader. So, in my stories and in my guiding years and the things that I do, I certainly try to do that, but I would never lead someone to think that I have them all the time. I would love to have constant wonder, but I think it might be exhausting to be constantly in that mode. But it is important to return to it. And sometimes when I'm talking about what we call meditation, I just call it returning. You've been busy at the computer, you've been answering emails, you've been doing whatever. I need to return to myself, my real self, my deeper self. So maybe I'll go sit by the stream. Maybe I'll just go out in the woods and sit on a stump for 10 minutes. Maybe I'll go for a walk in the forest. Doesn't have to be a 500-mile journey down a wild river. Although that's great. I'm glad I've been able to do it. But I still get caught up in, the crap of everyday life, just like everybody does. I had 2 fender benders last month, and I wasn't feeling especially spiritual or wonderful at that, and many other instances as well. But if I keep in mind this idea, okay, it's time to return, time to come back. I'm not going away somewhere else, but returning to who I really am at the deepest level of connection.
Thanks for listening to Constant Wonder. I'm Marcus Smith. We've spent our time in this episode with Douglas Wood. He's a wilderness guide, a songwriter, and an author. He's written over 40 beloved children's books. His most recent book, however, is for adults this time. It's titled A Wild Path. This episode was produced by Eric Schultzka with help from Lydia McElroy. Sound designed by James Call. Constant Wonder is a production of BYU Radio.